Hey, good evening, everybody. How are y'all doing tonight? I'm excited to welcome everybody to week 3 of the Great Commission 101. Tonight we've got the Unstoppable Advance, a history of Christian missions. If you were not here for the first 2 weeks, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to those talks. Some people have asked, you can find them on our podcast and YouTube page, which is 516 Church. I always find it by just going to YouTube and looking up 516 Church. I'm very excited for tonight's talk. Personally, outside of Scripture, I don't think that there's anything more exciting than church history, and in particular missions history. Really, it's a story filled with just ordinary people who were empowered by God's Spirit to do really great things in the world. And really, if you think about it, it's the continuation of what started in the book of Acts. It's just been a remarkable story of God building his church throughout the entire world. In addition to the night's talk, if you would like a great introductory book on Christian missions, I highly recommend this one. It's called From Jerusalem to Irian Jaya, A Biographical History of Christian Missions. It's by Ruth A. Tucker. I'm going to leave my copy out there on the table. The edges, my dog bit years ago, tore up. So that's why it looks the way it does. But I highly recommend this book, really. It's one of the first books I read on Christian missions years ago. One of the things she does is she tells the story through biographies. So she talks about the different missionaries and where they went, the things they did. I think that's one of the best resources if you want extra reading in addition to the rest of the course. Before I welcome our speaker tonight, I want to open up in a word of prayer. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, we come before you again tonight, and we ask that you would come be with us. I ask that you would open the eyes of our hearts to see your glory among the nations, how you've built your church throughout the centuries, and how you're going to continue to build your church, Lord. I pray that our hearts would be stirred. I pray that we would see your glory. I ask that you would come and please fill Shane with your spirit. Please give him wisdom, and we just ask you would come and speak to us. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm also very excited to welcome Shane Folks, who's a good friend of mine. We first met probably 10 years ago when we were both at Grace Baptist. We ended up becoming roommates. We've been in each other's weddings, and we've just had the privilege of being friends throughout the years and really partners in the gospel. It's just been great to have a friend like him who loves missions, loves God's word. So I'm so excited to have him. He earned his official biography is that Shane earned his PhD in world religions from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He also holds an MA in Muslim studies from Columbia International University and an M.Div from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. You have another one too, don't you? He has over 15 years of ministry experience. He served as a musical worship leader, pastor, adjunct professor, and Christian K-12 educator. Currently works for LSU Online and worships at Christ Covenant Church here in Baton Rouge. Above all, he is a devoted husband to his wife, Hannah, and a loving father to their daughter, Addie, and they've got another child on the way. So please join me in welcoming Shane Folks.
Well, it is certainly a pleasure to be here with you this evening and to talk about Christian missions. And Chris and I, we go back a long ways. And I was thinking about it on the way here. It's funny, we've dreamed a lot and made a lot of plans for what we would do overseas, and we're just waiting on a rich benefactor to die and leave us their money. So if that's you, we have plans. If you know of anybody, we certainly have plans. But it is a joy to be here with you tonight to talk about the history of missions. I will admit it's a daunting task. We're going to cover 2,000 years in under 2 hours. Now, my goal is that when you leave tonight, you say, that was really interesting, and not, that felt like 2,000 years. So we'll see how I do. But in saying that we're going to cover that much time, obviously we can't cover everything. We're going to hit the highlights. We're going to hit some things that I think are interesting. You know, one of the perks of being a teacher is I get to decide what's interesting. And so we're going to hit some key events, some key people. I hope that you're encouraged by some of the stories. I hope that you're maybe challenged by some of the stories. And that perhaps even after tonight, you begin to get another book or watch more videos and dig into maybe someone that stood out to you or a particular time period that stood out to you. So as we get going tonight, let me also just apologize for a bit of a scratchy throat and the occasional cough. Shorts yesterday and snow tomorrow is throwing my allergies off. Anybody sympathize with that? They're trying to figure out what season we're in. So, but we're gonna go through it. So what we're gonna do tonight is I've broken this up into rough periods of history. And we're going to move quickly. Not every period of history is going to get the same amount of time. In fact, the first one we're going to move through quite quickly because as you get past that, more exciting things happen. And I really want to camp out on those. So you can see we're going from AD 100, the end of the first century there, and you think about the book of Acts ending. We're going to go from there all the way up to the turn of the century at the year 2000. I know it's a lot, but it's going to be good. So a couple of notes as we get started here. Number one, you may have the question, why even talk about this? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. I don't want you to nominate yourself, but I'm sure you may have this thought of why study the history of missions? Why not just move forward and not worry about what's behind us? Well, let me give you a couple of reasons. One is to locate ourselves in God's redemptive history. There are a lot of people who came before us. A lot of faithful saints that have come before us, and we need to figure out where our place is in that history. There's also a lot of warnings to be learned from history. There's a lot of encouragement. I was talking to Marshall earlier before the service. There's a lot of encouragement in learning about these saints who went before us and the sacrifices they made, in the courage that they showed, their faithfulness to Christ. So there's a lot to be gained from this. And then also just to think about where is our place in missions. You may not be called to go to some foreign land, but you can be involved in missions here in Baton Rouge. And so my hope is that maybe in studying some of this history, you might be stirred to take on a new work, or maybe be more involved in an ongoing session or an ongoing type of work. Our strategy for tonight, let me go back. We are going to, for each time period, we're going to talk about a little bit of the background. So what's going on in the world during this time? Well, a little bit of geography. We'll show some maps. We'll talk about a little bit of the politics that's going on. And then we'll take a broad view and say, what are the major developments or initiatives as we think about missions? And then what are a couple of people that we can study their lives, see what they contributed to missions? Some of those are going to be people that you've probably heard of. Maybe some aren't. Some of them are my personal favorites. Again, I just get to put them in there and talk about them because they're my favorites. But I think you'll be encouraged and informed by that. And then one last note, just a note here on the Roman Catholic Church. If you know church history, you'll know, and particularly mission history, Protestants did not invent mission work. In the 1800s. We were not the first to think of it. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight, certainly up to the Protestant Reformation, is the church in the Western Roman Empire was the Roman Catholic Church, certainly after about the year 600. And so when we talk about missions for a lot of our session tonight, we're not talking about Protestant missions. We're just talking about church missions because that's all there was. There was just the church. But then once we get to the Protestant Reformation, we will focus more solely on Protestants. Though to be fair, it took them a couple of centuries to really take up the mantle, and we'll talk about that as well. All right, everybody on board? Anybody? Oh, thank you. She gets gold stars or something.
We'll make these slides available, so if you're worried about it, we'll get them out.
Yes, I don't expect you to take notes. Just sit back and bask in the glory of my pictures that I've put on here. They are amazing. Thank you, Google. So let's jump in and get started, all right? Mission in the early church. This is roughly 8 centuries. We're going from AD 100 to 750. I know that's a broad time, but we're going to move quickly here because the main reason is in this period, we have a lot of initial outreach efforts and a lot of sort of sporadic individual missionaries, but we don't have a lot of formal, systematic, large-scale mission efforts that we're going to see in the next period. And that's what I really want to get to. So in this period, we're just kind of talking about some initial advance of the gospel. And what we're going to talk about is a little bit of 3 directions. The gospel is moving to the west, it's going to move to the south, and it's going to move to the east. And we're going to talk about a little bit of where that is and people that were involved. So map time, if you remember your church history or if you've got a Bible, you may have a map like this in the back. This is the Roman Empire right around the beginning of the 2nd century. As you can see, it goes all the way across North Africa, from Middle East over here, North Africa, Spain, all the way into Europe, and even the British Isles. This is really Rome at its glory days, at its largest expanse. And from here, from the end of the first century there, the gospel begins to move. And so I want to start here as we think about the gospel moving to the west. This is the gospel going to Spain. Everybody knows where Spain is. Gaul, that's sort of southwest Europe. We might think about France and that area in there, and then all the way up to the British Isles. The gospel is going to move and expand here. Now, we're not always sure. We don't always have record of how the gospel got there. One of the things I'll mention later is that so many of our missionaries in this period are anonymous. But somehow the gospel begins to make it. Some traditions say actually that it was Crescens. Remember him from 2 Timothy? There's a tradition that says that he actually had gone to minister up in this region. Again, that's tradition. We don't really know if that's the case. Most likely the gospel expanded through trade and immigration. If you are a fisherman or a person who trades goods and you come to know Christ, well, your job is the same tomorrow. But now as you travel and you sell your goods, you also tell people about Jesus. Another way the gospel often would expand is the Roman Empire. When there were periods of persecution, they had the bright idea that said, okay, well, these Christians are causing a problem. We're going to take them and just move them somewhere else so they can't cause a problem. But of course, the irony is all they actually did was help to spread the gospel. And so in these first centuries here, the gospel begins to go west. If you've ever heard of a man named Irenaeus, he was a bishop and an author. He was ministering in this region. And what's interesting is that so many of the people that we do have record of, they were priests, they were bishops, they were pastors, they were church folk who in their time, in addition to serving for their congregations, they reached out to the lost people around them. And they shared the gospel. Moving up to the British Isles there, again, we don't know how the gospel got there. But we do know that by roughly the year 400, most of the Britain people or the British people would have been evangelized. The Anglo-Saxons, that was a little tougher. That took a few more centuries because of the violence. They were a group that had come over from the European mainland. So it took a while to get them. One of my favorite stories is of St. Patrick. You think about his ministry up in Ireland. It's an incredible story. If you don't know it, I encourage you to go and read a little bit more. He was a Roman Briton, kidnapped by the Irish into slavery for some 6 years, and in that time managed to learn the language and the culture, comes to escape, make it back to Britain, and whereas I think you and I would say, like, I made it out, that's it, he then says that he felt a call to go back to his captors and proclaim the gospel to them, and that he did. He went back to Ireland for some 30 years, planting churches and reaching the lost. We're going to see several examples of people throughout history that reached places and people that would probably not be on you and I's list for places to go. I always sort of chuckle when I hear people say they're going on a mission trip to like Hawaii. I'm like, yeah, suffering for Jesus on the beach, right? Not a lot of Hawaiis in these first centuries of the church. There are people that are going to difficult places with violent people, and yet they were committed to proclaiming the gospel. And it's a really, really good encouragement for us. Now, let's go south a little bit over to Egypt. Again, we have these traditions of people going and taking the gospel. Here, it's supposedly Mark, that he had taken the gospel there. We don't know, again. But Egypt was interesting because there's this strong presence here of Gnosticism. If you've heard this term, it's a false teaching. Paul interacted with it in some of his writings. And so a lot of the early, what we would call missionaries in this region, are pastors, they're theologians, they're authors, and their mission is engaging this false teaching around them. I think there's a great sort of relevance to us today that, sure, we live in a sort of Christian-type culture and area, but, I mean, drive through town and you'll see buildings devoted to false teachings. And part of being a missionary, certainly in this early period, was speaking out against those false teachings. And so you get men like Clement of Alexandria, you get Origen, his student, and then most famously, Athanasius. Anybody know why he was famous? Was shouted out? No? He was the guy that spoke out against Arianism, and he was the main proponent for biblical orthodoxy in the Council of Nicaea. So there's some heavy hitters that come from Egypt here in the early church. Men who were committed not just to knowing the Bible, but to defending it, proclaiming it, and really challenging false teachings that were around them. Now, as we move west a little bit across North Africa, the church in North Africa really expanded. Massive growth there in those first couple of centuries. By the late 2nd century, you certainly have that. By the early 3rd century, again, no record of its beginning, but what is interesting is that the first written record of African Christianity is about the trial of the Sillerton martyrs. If you have not read that story, I highly encourage it. A couple of those martyrs were young women, one of whom had just had a baby. She literally was breastfeeding her baby before they took her out into the arena and fed her to the animals. And these are men and women who gave their lives for the sake of the gospel. They would not bow to Caesar. And that's the church there in North Africa. That's going to become important again as we move on. Now, moving east, again, map time as we're going from Egypt to the east. We've got Arabia. We're moving into what would have been the Persian Empire. We've got sort of Iraq, Iran, and then we're moving over into, you can just barely see where we're getting to India over there. And what's worth noting is that in this period from 100 to 750, the church went farther east than it did west. We may tend to think of missions as sort of a European type issue, a focus. But actually in this period, the church went much farther east. Within a couple of centuries, we've got churches in the Tigris-Euphrates valleys, or in between the two rivers there. We've got what are called Church of the East. That is not Eastern Orthodoxy. This is different. This is a group of people with various theological differences. They began to develop their own theological tradition. This would be people like the Nestorian Christianity or Monophysites. But they began to send their own missionaries. And the first known churches there in Arabia end up in Qatar, modern-day Qatar. As you move farther east, we get over to India. This is another one of those stories where tradition has it that Thomas took the gospel there after the ascension. There's not a lot of proof, but there is an interesting note. When the Portuguese show up in 1500, they find this community of roughly 100,000 Christians. That's a massive number. And those Christians actually sort of looked back to and identified as their heritage Thomas. And today, if you go to India, there's an actual, I guess you'd call it a denomination, but a group of churches known as Thomas Christians. They look back to Thomas as their spiritual founder. And then finally, as we move all the way over into Central Asia and China, many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Silk Road. This was a way of travel from Europe all the way across into China. And as I mentioned earlier, as these traders become Christians, they naturally go and spread the gospel. As Christians desire to be missionaries, they see this road as a way to go. And so many monks would go along this road. They would speak and preach along the way. They would get to China, and they would do missions. I think it's worth noting as well that many of these early missionaries took a holistic approach to mission. So it wasn't just preaching the gospel. It wasn't just talking about Jesus. It was building schools and hospitals and caring for the poor and caring for the sick. They really took a holistic approach to sharing the love of Jesus. They would also focus on translating Scripture into the Chinese language. I think it's also an interesting note here that there was such a strong Christian witness along the Silk Road that the Syriac word for merchant actually became synonymous with missionary. So if you called yourself a merchant, people just assumed, oh, you're a missionary, because there were so many people going along that route. Now, if we stopped here, we'd think, boy, this is great. The gospel is really poised, it's taking over, and it's expanding. But I want to end this session, this period of history, with what I think is the most important development in this time, and that is the rise of Muhammad and Islam. Because this really changes, certainly, the face of the Western Roman Empire and modern Europe, because when Muhammad comes along, dies in 632, born in 570, at that point, you've got Christianity all over the Roman Empire. We talked about North Africa was all Christian across there. But in a century after his death, all it took was a century, northern African Christianity is almost gone. And the Muslims spread, and you can actually see on this map in the sort of the tan part down here in Arabia, that's where it was when he died. But in a century, they spread and they take all over the old Persian Empire, all the way across North Africa. They're into Spain. They're actually knocking on the door of Europe. Go read about Charles Martel and the Battle of Tours. There's this massive expanse here. And all of these people who lived in once Christian lands now find themselves as spiritual minorities, living in Muslim lands. The question is, what do you do? Do you stay a Christian or do you convert to Islam? Well, many of them did convert for what, maybe many reasons. Some of them probably were just nominal Christians and said, fine, these guys are in charge, I'll roll with it. Some of them perhaps wanted to avoid persecution. But those who remained Christian would live in a status known as dhimmi. This is sort of a second-class citizen. It's a little bit like the mob, where you're paying for protection. You would pay a special tax to maintain your religion. And if you didn't pay that tax, well, then bad things might happen to you. It was a difficult time. And one of the things that I've often considered and wondered is, you have such a strong North African church, and then it's gone in a century. Why? There are many reasons. I don't know what the exact answers are, but in a century, it changes. And now, if you think about Christian Europe, you have the threat of Islam in three sides almost, really, sort of western, south, and east, and it's going to be difficult. But as we'll see in our next section, there are a lot of missionaries who take up the call to reach Muslims. So as we summarize, one of the things we're going to do here for each period is just ask two questions. Who were the missionaries and what did they do? Again, you don't have to take notes here, but just sort of summarizing, who were these missionaries? Number one is they were anonymous. I was thinking about this in preparation. So many of the missionaries that served in this period and gave their lives for Christ, nobody knows their name. There's no books written about them. There's no statues. There's no church in their honor. But you know who does know their name? God knows their name. Their names are anonymous here, but they are known in heaven. And I think one of the cool things one day when we get to heaven is I want to meet some of these guys. And some of these people that we don't even know about. Secondly, they were bivocational. These were people, this is long before missionary became a vocation. These were guys who most often they were merchants or traders, or they were bishops, they were priests, they were local church pastors who just gave their time to mission work. Thirdly, they were church-centered. I think it's very important that we note that mission is connected to the church. It's all about preaching Christ, people be saved and brought into the church. And lastly, they were cross-cultural laborers. That might mean moving to a different country. It might mean reaching the pagans that are around you, but they are reaching across those cultures to communicate the gospel. And what did they do? Well, they certainly suffered. We didn't delve too much into Roman persecution, but there's a lot of that. They evangelized. They contextualized. That's a fancy word for how can I communicate truth in a way you understand? And we'll get more of that later. They also gave themselves to translating the Bible and then ministering in word and deed. You ever heard that saying that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care? You see that a lot in this mission history. People who went out and they proclaimed the gospel, but they also fed people who were hungry. And they trained children, and they gave people an opportunity at learning a trade or something, or craft. Because what they wanted to do is they wanted to show the love of Jesus in both word and deed. Now, moving on. I told you we're going to go quickly. We are moving quickly. Let's talk about mission in the medieval church. So we're doing 750 to 1500. This is a massive time of space here, but there's so much that happens in here. So what we're going to talk about is the Dark Ages. Why are they dark? We're going to talk about where did mission occur. So there are new places that mission is happening. And then we're going to talk about what I think is the most significant development in this period, and that's the rise of mendicant orders. Anybody know what the word mendicant means? It means a beggar. So this is the rise of these religious orders that begged for money to survive so that they could spend all of their time doing mission work. So we're going to talk about those. Now, the Dark Ages, what made it so dark? This is the period roughly 500 to 1000. We often call it the Dark Ages. There's a couple of factors going on here. One is you have the decline of the Western Roman Empire. If you know your history, the eastern side, the Byzantine Empire, that continues to flourish until the 15th century when Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks. But on the western side, past about 400, Rome is in trouble. The Roman Empire, by 400, 500, Rome has fallen multiple times to different tribes. Its expanse is getting harder to control as the center crumbles. You have the rise of warring groups in this period. You've got the threat of Muslims. You've got the threat of Vikings. You've got the threat of warring tribes like the Goths. It's a tough time. You've also got sort of a theological darkness. You've got, in this period, false doctrines begin to creep into the church, things that are extra-biblical, things like the doctrine of purgatory. It's also a challenge and a dark period for the Roman Catholic Church in the West because not only do you have false doctrines, but you have corruption. You've got priests, you've got bishops who are using their influence and their power to gain wealth. You've got priests and even popes who are supposedly celibate but are somehow fathering children. It is a dark time for the Roman Catholic Church. It's a dark time to be living in this period. But despite all of that, there are these rays of light, these sort of movements of the gospel. And I want to begin here by talking about the Dominicans. Two of the groups that we're going to talk about in this period, two of these mendicant orders, are the Dominicans and the Franciscans. These are groups that are founded as mission agencies. We call them agencies. They are orders devoted to mission work. The Dominicans, founded by Dominic, it's an interesting story. He had actually found a deacon of a sort of false Christianity sect. And he gave himself to teaching this man orthodoxy and bringing him back into truth. And it was that experience of teaching and sort of correcting that really gave him this vision of, I want to do this more. I feel a calling to go to those who are caught in error and to bring them into the truth. And so his order is really formed in response to that heresy, that desire for truth. He had a vision for global mission. And I think, rather importantly, he considered preaching as foundational to the work. One of the things we're going to talk about a little bit when we get to the 20th century is how missions, broadly speaking, begins to move from how can I know Christ to how can I have a better life. And missions begins to be this sort of broad tent subject for any kind of improvement, business, hospitals, education, things like that. But for Dominic, he was committed to preaching. One of the monks in this period said it this way. I think it's a great illustration. He said, first the bow is bent in study, then the arrow is released in preaching. You get the image there? First the bow is bent in study, then the arrow is released in preaching. They were committed to studying and to being educated and trained and then going and preaching. I think there's a strong implication there for groups today who maybe don't require theological education of our missionaries. We're in a hurry to get you there. We need to get you to the field. Well, Dominic and his order did not see that urgency. They saw the urgency in being prepared, having something to say when you get there, to be able to teach and to preach and proclaim the gospel. This is Western Europe, just as an example of the most famous Dominican here. You may have heard of him, Thomas Aquinas, a theologian, a gifted teacher. He wrote something called the Summa Theologica. It's a massive volume, systematic theology, still considered one of the greatest theological works in the last 2,000 years. And one of the things that strikes me about that is, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but there's a temptation when we talk about history to think that we're all the first to figure things out. You ever have that thought? And everybody who went before us was just like country bumpkins. But there were a lot of brilliant people that served the Lord in the past, and we can learn a lot from them. Now, continuing in Western Europe, I mentioned earlier that the challenge is you've got a Muslim presence that's a threat. You also have the Vikings. I love Viking history stuff. It's so interesting. These were Scandinavian peoples. They began to come down and attack Europe. They would raid, they would pillage, they would often sack entire towns, they would sack monasteries, anything of value they would take. They would even take people. And what's interesting is, if you want sort of a homework assignment, is to go and look at the missionaries, these monks, who sought to reach the Vikings. Now that just says something to me, because you're talking about this violent group of people who has been waging war on your continent, unspeakable horrors, and yet you feel a call to take the gospel to them. That says a lot about the grace of God and the mercy that he would have for them. And I think it's a great model, just a challenge for us. We often think about, if I'm going to do missions, I want to go to the easiest place, the people that are most receptive, and then where I can see the most fruit. But a lot of the missionaries throughout church history went to the exact opposite. They went to the hardest place with the hardest people and the least amount of fruit. People like the Vikings. Now, as we move a little bit farther south, we think about the Middle East and North Africa. Being a Christian under Muslim rule, it wasn't always easy. Largely, it depended on who was in charge. If the person in charge did not like Christians, then you had a tough time. Excuse me. Certainly, you would have this dhimmi status, but you might be precluded from society. There were things you could not do, places you could not go. But if your respective leader actually was a little bit kinder toward Christians, a lot of Christians in this period actually could have respectable jobs. Some of them worked in government positions, and from that, they began to reach out to the Muslims around them. One example of this I just want to mention is a guy named Timothy of Baghdad. So Timothy was a bishop. He actually worked in the court of the ruling leader. So somebody who had pretty high status, apparently had a high degree of respect and sort of just a good interaction, a good relationship with the Muslims around him. And he had this interesting event that happens in the year 781. So the guy in charge, the caliph, that's an Arabic word for basically the leader of that region or that dynasty, reaches out to Timothy and says, hey, I want to talk about what you believe and what I believe. And I'm going to set aside 2 days for this. I'm going to guarantee your safety there, and while we're there, you can say anything you want. We're just going to have it out. Now, that's a pretty cool invite. But if you're a Christian living in Muslim lands, I might be a little bit leery. I might be sort of trying to say things nicely and sort of not just go full bore on, this is what I believe and you're wrong. But he goes and he has this dialogue, and they talk about heavy-hitting stuff. They talk about the nitty-gritty. For example, they talk about how could God have a son? They talk about why Christians worship 3 gods. And they talk about why Christians don't follow Muhammad. So this isn't a modern-day dialogue. If you go on Facebook or YouTube and you see these events where it's Muslims and Christian dialogue, oftentimes it's let's boil things down to the lowest common denominator so we can all be nice and peaceful and talk about what we have in common. But Timothy did not do that. He said, if we're going to have a dialogue here and really discuss what we believe, we need to get what is actually dividing us and what actually matters. And I think there's a lesson there for mission work today. To be respectful, yes, but to be clear and bold in our teaching. Not everybody who sought to engage Muslims with the gospel took that approach. We'll get to one of those here in a moment. Somebody else who really kind of followed in this sort of vein of peaceful interactions and things like that was a guy named Francis of Assisi. Remember I mentioned earlier there were 2 of these mendicant orders, the Dominicans, and now the Franciscans. So Francis of Assisi comes along. He's the son of a wealthy Italian textile merchant, really born into privilege, probably could have done anything he wanted. But as a young man, he's thrown in prison during one of Italy's civil wars. And that time in prison seems to have changed him. Because he comes out of prison and he converts and becomes a monk, and he strives to imitate the life of Christ. He wants to practice poverty, preaching, and caring for the poor. And so he gathers men around him, and he forms this order known as the Franciscans. But Francis, he actually had a particular desire to reach the Saracens. That's a word that was commonly used to refer to Muslims at that time. And again, I'm struck by people like Francis because you think about, okay, I'm a Christian now, I want to do mission work, where could I go? He says, I want to go to the Middle East, I want to go to the Holy Land and reach Muslims. This is a dangerous time. This is a sort of Christian crusade period. This is not the time that I would choose to go to the Holy Land and try to reach Muslims. And yet he had this desire to go and do this. Interestingly enough, he tried to get there twice, but was actually prevented. The first time he tried to go, his ship wrecked. The second time he tried to go, he got too sick to go. But he was committed to it. And in 1219, he figures out a way to go to Egypt as a chaplain. And he gets to Egypt, and he's concerned with preaching the gospel to Muslims. So he does the craziest thing ever. He crosses the enemy lines into their camp and begins to minister and proclaim the gospel. And he actually gets this opportunity to meet with the Egyptian sultan and proclaim the gospel to him. Now you think, what in the world? Like, what would motivate someone to do that? Well, two things. One is he had a desire to preach the gospel. But Francis also had the desire for martyrdom. And what I mean by that is not that he was prepared to die for Christ, but that he actually wanted to. There's an interesting development at this period in church history where more and more people have this desire for martyrdom. It's really considered the sort of the ultimate service to the Lord. So it's not I'm serving the Lord no matter what happens. It's actually I am pursuing martyrdom. I want to put myself into situations where it's very likely that I will die for Christ because that's my ultimate sacrifice. That's the ultimate good that I could do for the Lord. Now, for Francis, it doesn't work that way. He manages to stay alive and do a lot of mission work. But I think he is a model for us in his willingness to go into dangerous places, but also the type of just friendly demeanor, peaceful conversations. It's not hiding truth, it's not avoiding the difficulties, but it's doing ministry in difficult places, but in such a way that is winsome. Maybe you've heard this phrase, there's something known as like a word fitly spoken. We talk about being winsome in our evangelism. You drive through the streets, sometimes you'll see these guys on the corner with their like loudspeakers and they're just yelling at everybody that drives by. Not necessarily the most winsome. But to have a conversation and to sit down and to really chat and just share the love of Christ, it carries a lot of weight. It sort of disarms people. Now, somebody who's one of my personal interesting characters that took the opposite approach is a guy named Raymond Lull. Raymond Lull was a Franciscan monk from Majorca, that's over near Spain, and he spent 9 years learning Arabic. He was committed to reaching Muslims with the gospel, and he was engaged in some short-term trips, really trying to reach the Muslims. He was concerned about training. He actually convinced the Pope to include training on Islam into the university. So, I mean, he's very committed. But like Francis, he has a desire for martyrdom. And unlike Francis, Raymond Lull's approach is polemic. You know what polemic means? It's openly critical and very sort of divisive. It's the sort of speech that, if you disagree with someone, you just blast them. Here's what you believe, here's why it's wrong, here's why I'm right, and that's just it. Now, there's a time and place for that. But Raymond Lull, that was his. I mean, I love him as a figure in church history because he knew what he believed, and boy, he was passionate about it. And so he took 3 trips to North Africa. In the first 2, he got ran out of there because his model was, again, it's North Africa, this is Muslim lands. His model was, he rolls into town, he goes to the middle of town, you think about the place where everybody's doing their business, he would stand up on something tall, and he would just begin to preach boldly and critically of Islam. The Quran is wrong, Muhammad is not a prophet, you guys need to come to the truth, Jesus is Lord. I mean, he is preaching this boldly. And unsurprisingly, he gets run out of town both times under threat of being stoned. I might take that as a lesson to go somewhere else. But again, Raymond Lull had this desire for martyrdom. He was not trying to avoid it. He was actually seeking it out. And so he goes back a third time. And everybody had told him, if you go back, you're going to die. But he goes back a third time. He walks straight into the middle of town. He gets up and he starts preaching again. And they stone him at age 83. Now, what would motivate a man to do this? I think it's the glory of God, desire to see Christ proclaimed. And for Raymond Lull as well in this period, it's this desire for martyrdom. He saw it as the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate service to the Lord. One of the things that I've thought about often is, what if he hadn't gone back? Think about maybe the service he could have provided to the kingdom with teaching or recruiting other missionaries, training, things like that. I'm not going to judge his desire for martyrdom, but I think from my perspective, he could have done so much more for the kingdom alive. But in this period, he sought to give his life for Christ. Now, if you are interested in reading his story, I do highly recommend it. There's a book written by Samuel Zwemer, another missionary we'll talk about shortly. You can find this on Amazon. It's a really short read, and it's just really interesting. His call to, Raymond Lull basically was living it up, man. He had lavish lifestyle, just like pagan life. I mean, he's just living it up for himself. And then comes around and comes to Christ and wants to reach the Muslims. He has like an Arabic-speaking slave, and he learns the language. It's an incredible story. I highly recommend it. So if you want to find that and read that later, I would encourage you. Now, lastly, in this period, I believe we're going to talk about is Central Asia. So the big factor here is the Mongol Empire. A massive amount of land here, China and Siberia in this area. This was a difficult place to reach again. A lot of Christians who went there were Christians. A lot of those who died were monks. And really, over the centuries, as people tried to reach them for the gospel, there was no great interest. And one of the factors here is because the leaders of the Mongol Empire were not interested, it never made much traction. If you can get the leaders interested in Christianity, what often happened was you could get sort of the people involved as well. But that never happened, and so the Mongol Empire really never was captured for Christ in this time period or any time after. So as we think about the year here of 750 to 1500, who were they? Well, the vast majority were monks. Now that's different a little bit than the period that went before. The vast majority of the missionaries in this period are monks. And I think one of the most important factors that really facilitates missions here is these mendicant orders. Because now what you have is not just individuals going out for Christ. Now you have orders with the resources and the organization, the contacts. I mean, things are getting planned out now. And when you do that, you're able to cover a lot more ground. And so with the rise of the Dominicans and the Franciscans, we see really an explosion in the number of people going and doing mission work. And then lastly, who were they? A lot of them were national conversions, so we're getting people who are converted in those areas and they begin to do mission work. One of the most important ways that mission is going to happen is when locals do the work. It's not going to be Westerners who take the gospel everywhere. It must be locals. They're the ones who are going to do that. And so we see that a lot more in this period. And then what did they do? Well, they labored in the context of Christendom. Now, this is different because this is well past Constantine. Now Christianity is an official religion in a lot of these regions. And they labored in the context of Christendom, meaning this area where the religion, the church, and the state are really one. Now, that has benefits because you have a lot of freedom to go and do things in places, but also has some drawbacks here because how do you separate the church and the state? If we come in and we share the gospel, are we bringing that on behalf of Christ, or are we trying to simply expand our country? There's a lot of issues there. They ministered in vulnerability, particularly among Muslims. They ministered again in word and deed. They engaged other world religions, and they learned language and culture. That's something that we're going to see over and over and over. All right. If you are interested in a little bit more history on these mendicant orders, these missionary monks, I do recommend Dr. Smithers' book. He was one of my professors, and he's written a really good introduction. It's not 1,000 pages long. It is very accessible, and it just introduces you to these missionary monks, these men who gave their lives to form these orders, to demonstrate the love of Christ in their lives to those around them, and are really they're really the only ones in this period doing mission work to any great extent. So there's a lot to be learned there, and I do recommend his book if you're interested. Now, before we take a break here in just a couple of minutes, let's take one more chunk of history, mission in the early modern church. So 1500 to 1800. We're getting closer to maybe some names we might recognize and some people that we would want to hear more about. So mission in the early modern church. We're going to talk about some of the difficulties, the gospel going to new lands, and then now we're finally going to get the emergence of Protestants, and we're going to see what they do when it comes to missions. All right? So you think about 1500 to 1800. This is the age of discovery. This is European nations. You know, we're sending ships out, and we're finding new lands, and we're claiming them for our country. This is really an extension, we might say, of the Crusades. We're just out there to take more land so that the Muslims can't take it before us. The goal also here is to reconnect with the East and really to control new lands so that we can then bring those lands into Christendom. Now, that's not the same thing as bringing those people to Christ, but it does at least get us over there in a place where we can take the gospel. And in 1454, Pope Nicholas V blessed the Spanish and the Portuguese and divided the world between them. That's pretty bold, isn't it? Okay, guys, here's the whole country. Spain, you get this half. Portugal, you get that half. But it really it opens the doors here for a lot of gospel expansion. Now, there are some things that happen in this period that are really tough to handle. You know, you're going in and you're conquering new lands, you're forced almost into slavery, you're doing all this stuff, and then along comes the gospel with that. So things get really messy in this period. But there are two groups that really seek to expand the gospel. Remember in the last session we talked about the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Well, in this time period, we're going to get two groups, one of which is called the Jesuits. Everybody heard of the Jesuits? This is when they show up, founded by Ignatius of Loyola. And he has an interesting story. At 15, he was in the Spanish royal court. So well on his way to being influential figure, rising up, could have done all kinds of things. But in 1521, he is in a battle, and a cannonball crushes his leg. And he's put into a hospital. He spent this long recovery period reading. And during that recovery period, he's converted to faith in Christ. And he learns about people like St. Francis and Dominic. And he says, I want to do that. I want to emulate the lives of those men. He goes into the University of Paris in 1528. He spends 7 years studying theology. Again, I want to highlight, he sought to be prepared before he went. He studied theology. And along with a group of friends, they covenant together to form this society. And eventually the Pope actually recognizes them as the Society of Jesus. If you ever see a Roman Catholic priest with S.J. initials after his name, he's a Jesuit. That's the Society of Jesus. Now the other group here, I think if I skip one here. Oh, well, let me not skip over this. So the Jesuits, they continued the mendicant tradition. That's the begging tradition. They were sort of like this spiritual military troop ready to travel. And they also had a willingness to engage resistant peoples like Muslims. I think it's so important how many of these people sought not easy ministry, but the hardest ministry. Now, the other group that comes along in this period is a group known as Propaganda Fide. That's the propagation of the gospel. This is launched in 1622. It comes about for maybe not the best of reasons. Simply put, Rome wanted more control over mission efforts. They wanted mission efforts to sort of run through them so that they could control it more. Maybe not the best of motivations, but I will give them credit that this new initiative was committed to church planting. They wanted to raise up more priests, more bishops. And most interesting, I think, is they were committed to a clear gospel presentation using this word I just created, uncultured. What I mean by that is they were committed to taking the gospel to foreign lands such that people would become Christians, not necessarily Western Christians. And there's a difference. One of the issues in mission that we'll get into, certainly in the 1800s, 1900s, is what's the relationship between taking the gospel and taking my culture? Am I out to see people come to know Christ, or am I out to see people become British, French? And that is still an issue today, really, in the mission world. The debate there, when I go to this foreign land and I show up and I'm here to teach them about Jesus, can they know Christ and yet still look like the same people? Do I need them to look like me? It's a debate here. But what I like about this group in Propaganda Fide is that they were committed, centuries before this really became a hot-button issue, to taking the gospel uncultured. And I want to read a quote for you. I think this is really striking. I just want to read the first couple of lines here. So from the committee that's formed here, they said, "Do not regard it as your task, and do not bring any pressure to bear on the peoples to change their manners, customs, and uses unless they are evidently contrary to religion and sound morals." So don't think it's your job to show up and change them into French people or into Spanish people. Don't go trying to change things unless it's clearly opposed to sort of biblical morality. And then, what a great statement. What could be more absurd than to transport France, Spain, Italy, or some other European country to China? These guys are centuries ahead of their time in making this case for taking the gospel uncultured. You can go to a country in Africa, you can go to China and teach the truth of Christ. People can be saved and still look Chinese. They don't have to change their clothes. They don't have to change the style of their buildings. They don't have to change what they eat. They can actually be Chinese Christians as opposed to French or Spanish or Western Christians. This is a huge moment. When I read this, about fell out of my chair when I read this, because it's such a great commitment, and it really shows just an awareness of the importance of what really matters. It's not going out trying to make Europeans of everybody. And this is something that the church often got wrong. You'll read about, you think about 1800s and 1900s, Christians who went out and they're saying things like, "We're here to bring civilization to you. We're here to civilize the savages." Well, that's not what we're supposed to be about. We're supposed to be about, we're here to see people come to know Christ. And what I appreciate about Propaganda Fide and this statement is that they understood that. Now, did it always happen perfectly? Not necessarily, but I think that's a great line there for us. Now, one of the famous missionaries in this period, Francis Xavier, ends up in India in 1542. He goes as a representative of the Portuguese king. His task is to minister both to Portuguese expats and the local people. But when he gets there, he finds that there's a group of Christians, perhaps mostly nominal, but there was a group of Christians that had not been discipled. These pearl fishermen. Apparently, someone had come before him, had preached the gospel. Some people had professed faith in Christ, and then the guy left. And so when Francis comes along, he says, "Okay, so you guys are all claiming to be Christians, but no one's taught you anything." And so he commits to doing that. He starts a church, he ministers to children, and he gives himself to teaching the people there and actually doing discipleship. Notably, though, he did not set apart indigenous church leaders. So not everybody, again, has really caught on to this thing of we're all about the locals being the locals, and they can know Christ, and they can do the ministry. There's still a little bit of this, well, you need us to be in charge. But he did some good things there in teaching. After a few years in India, he manages to go over to Japan in 1549, and he took the approach of going to the person in charge, the daimyo, and asking for permission. Can I share the gospel in your territory? Can I teach people about Jesus under your watch? And if they said yes, great. And that gave you a lot of leeway there to do that. He did struggle with the language, but interestingly, he sought to find cultural bridges. You know what a bridge is for the gospel? A bridge is essentially an illustration or an element from culture that you can use to sort of steer to a gospel conversation. All right, I'll give you just a sort of, this is sort of tongue-in-cheek example, but anybody remember the song? Was it Carrie Underwood, Jesus Take the Wheel? Well, that's a bridge. Not necessarily the best one, but that's a bridge. You can say, hey, do you ever feel like you just need somebody to take the wheel for you? People are like, yeah, I really do. Well, Jesus can take the wheel for you. That's a bridge. Again, not the best one. But Francis was committed to this. What he realized was there are elements in culture here. Maybe it would be a reverence for your ancestors, a reverence for those who went before you. There are things about the culture that I can use and say, you know what, there's something there like what we have in Scripture, like what we have in Christianity. Let me teach you about that. And this is really, this is monumental because prior to this, certainly for Francis, but even others as well, there's a tendency to roll up into a new place and say, okay, everything you're doing is wrong, and I'm going to tell you all the truth. But Francis comes along and he realizes there's some things about this culture that I don't have to just burn it to the ground. There are things here that are good and that can be kept even after the gospel. And I want to read for you just a short quote, and we'll take a break. That Stephen Neal, in his History of Missions, he talks about how Xavier, in his earlier years, he accepted this doctrine of tabula rasa, the view that essentially in a non-Christian culture, there's nothing good, nothing worth keeping. But when he gets later on in life and he gets over to Japan, he begins to realize that there are things worth keeping. And Neal says, now that he was confronted by a civilization with so many elements of nobility in it, he saw that while the gospel must transform and refine and recreate, it need not necessarily reject as worthless everything that has come before. And that will also be a continuing challenge for the church in the coming centuries. How much of this culture that we're going to reach needs to be just completely removed, and how much of it can we keep? And honestly, that's a challenge for us today. How much of the culture around us can we accept? How much of it do we reject? I think everybody drove here tonight. Nobody brought a horse. So there's something we can accept there. But there's some things that we can't do. There's some things that we're not going to watch. There's some places we're not going to go. There's some jobs that we're not going to have. Our culture may do all those things, but we're going to say we're different and we can't do that. And so Xavier was committed to trying to find something in the culture that he could actually reach out to and say, this is a great spot for me to inject some gospel truth. All right? Now, let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the Protestant Reformation. Protestants are getting on board. Okay? We're going to get started again. We've made it 1,500 years. You are 1,500 years older, I mean smarter, and it's all downhill from here. So a lot of what we talked about, well, really all of what we've talked about up to this point is mission efforts from just the church, which would have been the Roman Catholic Church at this point. But we finally get to the Protestant Reformation. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on the Reformation. That would be a whole different class. But really just mentioning it here as this important event, because we want to talk about how this event then impacts Protestant missions. And so, as you probably know the story, 1517, Martin Luther, he nails his 95 Theses to the door. He is arguing for justification by faith, the authority of Scripture, the importance of translating the Bible into local languages. He also has a great deal to say about indulgences. But the Reformation is really this monumental event in Europe. And it's a rediscovery of the gospel. And out of this will come new denominations. Out of this will come new creedal documents. I mean, really a reestablishment of gospel truth and the authority and supremacy of Scripture. A lot of stuff is really going to come out of this. But what's interesting is that in the first couple of centuries, really, after the Protestant Reformation, what does not come from this is a lot of mission work. What comes from this is not any formalized, large-scale mission efforts, nothing like what we've seen with the Dominicans or the Franciscans or other groups like that. And so one of the questions that I've had really for years and have been trying to think about is why? This great period of the rediscovery of the gospel and these figures like Calvin and Luther and Zwingli and all these guys, this great moment why does it not produce a global mission effort right away? Let me give you a couple of reasons. I've been helped in this thinking by Dr. Smither's book. A couple of reasons here. First, just thinking practically. Protestants largely didn't have ships. It's hard to go all over the world without a boat. Land travel wasn't much easier because most of Europe was caught up in wars in this time. And then thirdly, I think it's probably one of the most significant features or reasons is the lack of structures. We saw in the first 8 centuries that mission was really sort of sporadic. When you finally get those mendicant orders, things are formalized, and there's really this explosion of missionaries being sent out because they have the structure. Protestants don't have that early on. And so you really don't see really much mission effort on Protestants. Now, that doesn't necessarily help me to square this in my mind, because I think, how could you get all the theology right now, but you haven't gone? And then I read this quote I want to share with you. I know it's kind of lengthy there. I'm just going to hit the highlights from Dr. Smither's book. And what he points out in this, he says, ultimately, the general Protestant focus best reflects Luther's view on Matthew 28, where you're making disciples. And what you get is that ministry extends to evangelizing families and bringing the Reformation to bear in society. So Reformation mission could best be described as a mission to evangelize and teach the established church. And then he says this last line I think is really good. He says, while the arena of God's mission is the whole earth and we are to declare his glory among the nations, Psalm 96, the early Protestant reformers remind us that mission to our Jerusalem will always be needed. When I read that quote, it was like a light bulb came on. Because what I've always heard people say, well, why didn't the early Protestants do mission work? Well, the reality is they did. They just started at home. Because what they realized is that without healthy churches, you're never going to have these churches sending out missionaries. And when Jesus talks about how you're going to be my witnesses to the ends of the earth, where does he start? In Jerusalem. And so there's really a great lesson here, I think, for us. Because you may be here tonight thinking, look, I don't have the resources, the opportunity to go to some foreign land, so I guess there's nothing for me to do mission-wise. That is so wrong. There is so much to do here in our Jerusalem for the sake of missions. There are lost people here, and it's from here that then missions can go out. And so I think the reformers, what they were doing, I agree with Dr. Smither, they were doing missions. They were just starting at home because they realized if you don't fix it here, it's never going to go out from there and be fixed. So I think that was a really helpful sort of a quote for me to understand and kind of put this together in my mind why we don't see that initial wave of global mission work. Now, there were some exceptions in this period, a couple of early Protestant missionaries in North America. That's a quote of John Donne, if you like poetry, some of his sonnets. But he was actually a preacher as well. And so a lot of the English charters to form these new colonies in the Americas included in them a call to evangelize Native Americans. So it was go and take the land, form the colony, and preach the gospel. And so you see in the year 1701 the formulation here of this Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. Rolls right off the tongue. But it is one of the earliest societies here, and it's really a precursor to what we're going to see toward the end of the 18th century into the 19th century that's going to revolutionize Protestant missions. So it's one of these earliest societies that says we're going to formalize our efforts. And their goal was to evangelize Native Americans and even some of the African slaves. One of the most famous ones, someone you may have heard of, is a guy named David Brainerd. He was a young guy influenced by the revival preaching of Whitefield and was so stirred to reach the Native Americans for Christ that he actually left school, left Yale College, and decided to become an itinerant preacher among Native Americans. His most fruitful work there was among the Delaware Indians in New Jersey, but he contracted TB and died at 29. One of the things that you'll notice as you read about missionaries is how many of them died young. Now, to be fair, it was a difficult time, and most people didn't live that long. But how many of these people that were sort of these shining lights for the gospel died so young? But yet they gave themselves on the mission field. Now, David Brainerd probably would have been forgotten to history. None of us would probably even know about him if it weren't for his father-in-law-to-be, a guy named Jonathan Edwards. Much more famous person. And Edwards gathered up all of the writings, the journal, and everything of David Brainerd and published that book. I do highly recommend, as just a book to read, The Life and Diary of David Brainerd. You can put that in Amazon. There's tons of different versions, very, very cheap. And what's interesting is that this book would actually influence countless missionaries later on. Two of which I mentioned there, William Carey we'll talk about, and Henry Martin. Two very influential people in missions were encouraged, were stirred on to become missionaries because they read about David Brainerd. And that's one of the reasons that I think we should read about those who go before us. It may be that God uses a missionary biography to call you to go to the mission field. Or it may be from reading a biography that God puts a people group on your heart to organize prayer for, or sending resources, anything. I mean, who knows what God will do? But we learn from those who have gone before us. Now, before we end this period, I do want to give a nod to the one Protestant group that did orchestrate formal global missions in this period. They're really the standouts, and these are the Moravians. This guy here, this is Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, a German nobleman, a guy who really, man, he could have done anything. He actually had a blossoming career in public service, but he gave it up for ministry. He was influenced by the German pietists. He wanted to see missions take place, and he really gave all those things up and chose ministry. And he formed this group known as the Order of the Grain of the Mustard Seed. And it was focused on taking the gospel to the nations. And so what Zinzendorf says is, look, I've got all these resources. Let me give those to the kingdom. So he forms this place here on his homeland called Herrnhut. It means the Lord's Watch. And he basically opens up his entire home and land and everything to all of these Protestant refugees. He says, come here, we'll live together, we'll pray together, and we'll just sort of be together. And you get a lot of people like that together, along comes spiritual renewal. People start having this desire for the nations. They actually form this around-the-clock prayer meeting that runs for 100 years. I mean, wow. And in that is this new desire to take the gospel to foreign lands. And so they become one of the earliest sending agencies. They send missionaries to St. Thomas. They send these two guys out, Johann Dober and David Nitschmann. These are guys that they send as well to the Caribbean. And what the Moravians do is they're all about preaching a gospel of love and supporting themselves. So they were known for this. Whereas the mendicant orders, it was all about begging for things. The Moravians were all about being, we might say, tent makers, like the Apostle Paul. People who would go out and they would support themselves as carpenters or potters or things like that while they did mission efforts. And I just want to give you a staggering statistic. In this period, 1 in 60 of them served as cross-cultural missionaries. Now, that may not sound like much, but go and do the math. I had to bust out a calculator this week, just looking at my own background. I'm from the SBC world, at the number of foreign missionaries we have compared to the number of SBC people that we have. It is astronomically smaller. So to say that 1 in 60 Moravians served as cross-cultural missionaries, that is incredible. And in the 15th century, or I think the 18th century, I have it written there, they actually ventured to the East and West Indies, Greenland, North America, Suriname, and South Africa. So, as I mentioned earlier, we don't see a lot of this Protestant early mission, but the Moravians really stand out. And they're really a sort of a forerunner to what will come behind them. So in this period, as we wrap up, I want to skip this. Who were the early missionaries? A lot of them were monks from the Roman Catholic Church until you get a few Protestants. They're pastors, they're chaplains, and they are tent makers. And that actually will come back around in the 20th century. What did they do? They connected with leaders, they learned culture, evangelized, discipled, they set apart indigenous leaders, translated scriptures, and then they emerged from this spiritual awakening. So this period, there was a lot of things happening. A lot of really good things happening. Spiritual renewal is happening. The Great Awakenings. People are getting on board. There's a desire for mission work, and we're poised now to really just blow up and go to the nations. And that brings us to mission in what's called the Great Century. So AD 1800 to 1900, the Great Century. We're going to talk about a little bit of what is the 19th century world, what's happening. Mission societies, I had to cut some of that, but one of the reasons that there is such a massive amount of mission work in this time is because Protestants finally figured out we need mission-sending agencies and societies. That's the key. And then we'll talk about some of the missionaries, some of my favorite ones, in fact. So 19th century world, what's happening? Largely, it's colonialism. This is the era of European countries going to Africa, going to Asia, and carving out colonies for themselves. Now, that has some good things about it. That means that's new places for missionaries to go. But also, if you're a missionary showing up to tell people about Jesus and the people you're preaching to just got conquered by your people, you can imagine that would have some difficult conversations there. So one of the challenges in this period is this relationship between colonizing and evangelism. And the difficulties that missionaries have, some of them were all about it. Like, look, we're here in charge, and it's sort of all together. Some of the missionaries came along and said, look, I know you just got conquered. That's its own thing, but I want to tell you about Jesus. But it was difficult, for sure. Now, you also have the after effects of the Second Great Awakening. So this religious revival is happening. I think there's a really striking statistic there about church attendance growing from 10% to 40% in a matter of 30 years. Huge movement of God here in the Americas. And that's going to fuel people to go to the mission field. Okay? And so we're going to talk about a couple of missionaries here. Number one is William Carey. He's known as the father of modern missions. William Carey was the son of a weaver, grew up in England. He apprenticed as a cobbler. Anybody know what that is? It's not a dessert. It's a shoemaker, yes, thank you. So he's apprenticing there. He would have just been a shoemaker until he reads about the adventures of Captain James Cook, this sort of explorer type going and conquering the world. And by reading this sort of adventure book, God begins to open up his heart for the spiritual needs of the world. So it goes from just hey, there's cool stuff out there to, hey, there are people out there who need Jesus. And so in his shoe shop, he would actually put maps up on the wall to guide his thinking. I was thinking about this week I need to put a map in my office to just prompt my thinking during the day when I glance over at it and just pick a country and pray for them. Now, William Carey did that. He becomes convinced that global mission should be the mission of the church. This may sound crazy to us because we're thinking, of course it's the mission of the church. But there was a time when not everybody was convinced. He begins to talk about this. You may know this famous quote. He's talking to this group of pastors about how we need to go and reach the nations for Christ. And one old pastor stands up and says, "Sit down, young man. If God wants to evangelize the heathen, he'll do it without your help or mine." And that was sort of the thinking for a lot of people in this day. There was this idea that if God was going to save the nations in some foreign land, he was going to do it by a special work of the Spirit. He would just bring revival there. We didn't actually have to go. But William Carey was convinced. And so in 1792, he publishes this book, an inquiry into the obligations of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathens. It's not the catchiest title, but it really is a powerful work because he lays out this biblical case saying that missions isn't just something cool, isn't just something that we can think about, isn't just something for a select few, but this is actually the obligation of all Christians. That doesn't mean we all necessarily go or have the same role, but it means that we all have this obligation. And so he publishes this book. He's preaching on it. He's challenging people. He challenges this group of Christians. He says, expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. I mean, he's on fire. And so in 1792, again, he helps form the Baptist Missionary Society. It's one of those early societies that really lays the groundwork here for being able to send more missionaries. And so they appoint their first missionary, and of course, maybe unsurprisingly, William Carey, he gets on board. He says he wants to go. He volunteers for service. You can't tell everybody else to do it and you not do it. So he volunteers. Now, his wife, funny enough, was not exactly on board in the beginning. Wake up tomorrow and tell your spouse, hey, we're going to India. Let's go. I can see where that would be a little bit troubling. But she comes around to it. She gets on board. She says, yes, let's do that. So they get over to India in 1793. The British East India Company won't let them do anything there. They end up in West Bengal, and they just plant themselves down. William Carey, he works in an indigo factory, which you think that's not really mission work, but it was a great opportunity to be around lost people, and it was a great opportunity to learn the language and the culture. Just being there and doing work. Now, the difficulties come for Dorothy in this time. As you can imagine, moving to a place that's not your home, not a lot of Westerners around you, this is a difficult time for her. They eventually actually have one of their children, a 5-year-old son, Peter, dies, and Dorothy just basically descends into depression and mental illness. William Carey, he probably didn't handle it much better. He is said to have basically locked himself in a room and just spent hours upon hours in Bible translation. I mean, that's good on the one hand, but I think that was probably him just not wanting to face the truth. And as a result, it really strained their relationship. But help is coming. In 1800, they moved to a Dutch colony of Serampore. There's 2 other families there, and they all live in this compound. And that really was helpful because Dorothy at this point could not care for the children. And so you've got these other people that are there and able to help. So it was really a good thing for them. They had these values in their mission. They're all about evangelism, Bible distribution, church planning, indigenous leaders. That's important. That's a different one. And then contextual study. So this Serampore mission really becomes this launching point. They start schools, colleges, a printing press, planting churches, and he contributes to Bible translation in 36 languages. Wow. All of this there in Serampore. And so the question is he the father of modern missions? He's called that. In what way? Well, he's not the first Protestant missionary to go. He's not even the first guy to India. But he's really the pioneer to this new wave. He's really the front runner of what will be this massive new wave of missionaries from the West. And so that stat there at the end, from 1792 on to 1960, 80% of the Protestant missionaries in the world came from English-speaking nations. So William Carey is really at the front of this wave of missions. Now, one other character I want to mention here is Henry Martyn. If you're really paying attention, you'll note that and remember that he's one of the guys who read the life of David Brainerd. And that was part of his calling to mission service. He was a chaplain for the British East India Company and would engage in itinerant preaching, some of these polemical interactions with Muslims. Remember, that's the sort of critiquing, more openly critical. He gave himself to translating the New Testament into Hindi, Persian, and Arabic. But he's another one of these young guys. He gets TB and dies from consumption at 31. Another one of these who I just think about, man, if God had just given him 20 more years, what might have happened? Hudson Taylor is another famous missionary from this period, converted at 17, felt called to China. He studied theology, even did an apprenticeship in medicine. He's like, I'm going to be ready for anything. All of that in preparation. And they get to China in 1854. But what's interesting is he gets to China, he's arrived with this agency, Chinese Evangelization Society, and he gets there and realizes that all the missionaries are living on compounds. They're sort of just walled off places where they can live amongst themselves. And he says, I want to go reach people. Like, I'm going inland. Let's go. And so he actually leaves that agency and joins another one because he wants to get out of the city, get out of the compounds, and go where the people are. He marries a lady named Mary Dyer. They return to England after a while due to bad health. But at that time, he founded the China Inland Mission, this really prominent society for missionaries. And by 1934, there were actually 1,368 workers in China. So this is a massive organization that he starts. They had some guiding principles. They were interdenominational. I think one that stands out to me is the second one here, which is that they required no formal theological training. They were committed to saying, look, we got work to do. Let's just get the people there, and you can kind of study along the way. It's just different than what we've seen from some of the groups that went before us. They were also about a field-led mission, individual donors, adoption of Chinese culture. That's a big one. So, dressing like them, eating their foods, living in houses like they live. If you're going to be with the people, be with the people. And they were committed to evangelizing all of China. Lottie Moon, anybody ever heard of Lottie Moon? I would hope so. Certainly the most famous figure in SBC mission history. moved to China with what was then the Foreign Mission Board. It's now the International Mission Board. And taught in school for a while, and then moved to the interior to focus on evangelism and church planting. And you think about a single lady doing all this. This was big. This was really unusual at the time, but a lot of courage to do that. She served through some turbulent times in China, including wars, uprisings, and government turnover. She was an advocate early on for missionary care. She actually encouraged people to take a furlough. I mean, that was unheard of before then. Missionaries are said to have taken all their belongings to the field in a coffin, so that when you needed it, you had it, and that's what they sent back. And Lottie Moon actually said, you know what, we need to focus a little bit on taking care of our missionaries. And that was really, really life-changing, I think, at the time. Granted, she said a furlough every 10 years. That says something about her stamina. I think a lot of agencies now will do a furlough every 4 to 6, maybe 7 at the most. So she said they need a break, but she was tougher than a lot of us are, I think. Myself, for sure. In 1885, she began writing letters to these women's groups saying we need to raise money. And she's actually the namesake in the SBC world for the Lottie Moon Christmas offering, this annual Christmas offering raising money specifically for international missionaries. And the total for that passed $5 billion a couple years ago. All because a lady started writing letters saying, hey, let's organize an offering. Could there be another Lottie Moon in this room? Maybe. Maybe your role in missions is to be an organizer like that, to put the call out there and just say, hey, let's donate to this, and then see what God would do with it. We have the Judsons, Adoniram and Ann Judson, really known as the first traditional American missionaries sent from North America. They went out with the Congregationalist American Board. Funny story, I think. They go out and, it's a 4-month journey at sea. You've watched all the movies on board. You got nothing else to do. You start to read a book. They read Baptist theology on the way, and when they get there, they realize, hey, we're actually Baptists now. And there's nothing wrong with that, but the one problem was that the agency they went with was not Baptist. And that agency said, look, we hired you and we sent you. You should be what we think. And so they actually get there and they switch. They leave the group and they join the American Baptist Mission. They get baptized by William Carey. I think that's just a funny story. And it's just good. We all don't have it figured out. We learn, we grow, our things change. But they didn't just turn around and went home. They said, okay, our views have changed a little bit, but we're still committed to mission. So let's find a group for us. And they did that. They relocate to Burma in 1813, and they're doing really a lot of good missionary work there. They focused on evangelism, Bible translation, 10 believers after 6 years. That's hard labor to get that. He completes that dictionary. They're completing the Bible. So a lot of good stuff's happening, but not without hardship. This war happens in 1824, and Adoniram Judson is accused of being a spy, and they throw him in prison. And so Anne goes and visits him. She's got to bring him food, all the things. She's petitioning the government. My husband is not a spy. Let him out. 2 years before he's finally out, and shortly thereafter she dies, probably from just exhaustion and the worry. Later on, he does get remarried, but that's. Sometimes I ask the question of myself, just full disclosure, like, at what point would I pack up and go home? And I'm always struck by the fact that these guys don't. Hardships come and go, and they stay and they do the ministry. Speaking of hardship, we'll get to my favorite missionary in history, Samuel Zwemer. So we're going to be here about an hour. Go get you some more popcorn. I'm just kidding. Some of you are getting worried. So Zwemer is pledged to serve in the Muslim world. He goes to one of these student volunteer movement meetings, and he wants to go to the Muslim world. No one will send him. That is interesting to me, because now that's the place to go. Everyone's, the 1040 window, we're going to go reach the Muslim world. But at this point, no one was sending anybody there. And so he says, fine, I'll start my own. And he forms the American Arabian Mission. He arrives in Lebanon in 1890, begins studying Arabic. Eventually settles on the island of Bahrain and opens a Bible bookshop. One of the things I love about Samuel Zwemer is he was committed to the power of the printed word. I'll read a quote about that here in just a minute, but he was committed to distributing the Bible, evangelism, gospel tracts, polemical type apologetic documents, all of that. Literature distribution was key. And while he's there, funny story, so he gets to the Middle East with a guy friend. They're there, they're doing ministry, and it's not good for man to be alone. And lo and behold, a boat rolls into town. Who walks off that boat? 2 single ladies. I mean, God provides, right? There are 2 nurses from Australia. One of them is named Amy, and so she actually ends up marrying Zwaymer. But what's funny is her ticket to the Middle East was paid for by the agency she came with. And when she told them that, hey, I'm getting married to this guy and we're going to go somewhere, they said, well, you need to pay that ticket. Like, we paid to get you here and we're not getting the service from you. So Zwaymer had to go and pay that price, and he always joked about that was the bride price he had to pay for her, was the cost of getting her there. But they did ministry together. They were really great. But they were acquainted with grief. And in 1904, 2 of their daughters died in the same week from malaria. One was 7 and one was 4. And what's always struck me is what he wrote on the tombstone. Worthy is the Lamb to receive riches. It takes a lot to sacrifice that. When would we pack up and go home? But he didn't, because he considered it a worthy sacrifice for the Lamb. Now, he is most famous for, I think, his just prolific writing ministry. He wrote over 60 books. He traveled and spoke. He's one of those guys, we probably all know somebody like this, like just a God-given energy to do far more than any of us could ever do. I mean, he wrote, he traveled, he would preach and speak, multiple times a day, every day of the week in English, Dutch, or Arabic. It's just incredible what he did. And eventually he goes to Cairo and he's training. But this is the quote I want to read for you. The printed page is a missionary that can go anywhere and do so at minimum cost. It enters closed lands and reaches all strata of society. It does not grow weary, it needs no furlough, it lives longer than any missionary, it never gets ill, it penetrates through the mind to the heart and conscience, it has and is producing results everywhere, it has often lain dormant yet retained its life and bloomed years later. I think that's so insightful. And he labored in a place where it was actually pretty easy at the time to go and do mission just in person. But he realized that there are some places you just can't get to. And there's that missionary of the word, he doesn't need a furlough. He doesn't get tired. Just send that stuff out, and it may be years down the road when that actually blooms. His legacy, he labored for a couple of decades in the Middle East and had probably fewer than 10 converts in the entire time. I was having dinner with a missionary in Africa one time, and I mentioned that I really like Samuel Zwaymer, and the first thing he said was, but he had no converts. And then what he meant by that is he wasn't successful, had nothing to show for it. And if we judge success by converts, then sure, he wasn't. But if we judge by success by faithfulness to the gospel, faithfulness to ministry, the proclamation of Christ, then he was certainly successful. And I think what he contributed most to is his teaching and writing and mobilizing new missionaries. I think no figure in modern Protestant history mobilized and called up more missionaries than Samuel Zwaymer. So it may be that you are the next Zwaymer. Your mission may not be to go and see this massive fruit that happens, but your mission may be to raise up those who go and do see that fruit. And this quote I'll end with from Zwaymer here, and looking back, you remember losing the 2 daughters, the hardship and all that. He said, the sheer joy of it all comes back, and I would gladly do it all over again to bring the gospel to Western Arabia. And that says something, doesn't it? All the hardship, and he says, I'd gladly do it again. So one of my favorite missionary biographies I highly recommend. J. Christy Wilson, he replaced Zwaymer at Princeton Seminary. He wrote a biography called Apostle to Islam. Highly recommend it. It's easy to read, it's encouraging, all about their ministry there in Arabia. So in this period, difficulties obviously with imperialism and commercial expansion. Yes, there's mission, but it's influenced by a lot of different things going on. So who were these missionaries? Mostly men, a lot of married couples, but we do see some single women. We also get some non-Western and national missionaries. And then what did they do? A lot of things, really, in this period. They're starting mission societies, forming mission stations, planting churches, translating. They're doing hospitals and schools, indigenous leaders suffering. I mean, just all kind of things. It is the great century for sure. Now, lastly here, very quickly, mission in what's called the global century. So 1900 to 2000, we're finally getting to the end of this. We're going to mention just briefly some things that are happening in the 20th century world, some mission locations, and we're really just broadly saying, where are the areas of ministry in the 20th century that we saw movement and activity? I'll skip over this. You all have lived this. We're here in the 20th century world. We know what's happened. Wars, political change, post-colonialism, countries gaining their independence, all of that stuff. It's a massive amount of things that have happened in the 20th century world. But in that, mission continues. And the 20th century mission in China continues to be difficult. Everybody's seen Chariots of Fire? Good movie. Eric Liddell, Olympic runner, who goes after his Olympic run and goes to China as a missionary, where he dies. In 1927, the majority of their missionaries had departed due to turmoil and upheaval. It's hard to stay when there's fighting going on. China inland mission continued, certainly through the first half of the century. The biggest difficulty would be there in the Sino-Japanese War. So persecution is coming. It's amazing when you look at China today and the difficulties of being a Christian, the closeness to the gospel, to think about just 100 years ago how open it was and how much you could minister. But in the 20th century, you get the communist revolution with Mao Zedong, you get the cultural revolution, and now China is a closed and hard country to reach. But what's interesting is actually just look at the numbers. The church has continued to grow in China, despite it being such a closed country. The underground church continues. There are a lot of difficulties in the Middle East. I mentioned a while ago the 1040 window. Everybody know that sort of expanse of space across Africa and the Middle East? That's a period, that's a place where a lot of mission effort has been focused in the 20th century. The difficulty is that a lot of these countries, when they were colonized, you could go and do mission there. But in the 20th century, as they gain independence, they are becoming more and more closed to the gospel. You see a lot of anti-Western sentiment. Some of you are old enough to remember the Iranian Revolution. A lot of very strong anti-Western thinking and just we don't want anybody involved here. And so countries that were once open are now considered closed. And one of the big developments in the 20th century in the Middle East is what we call business as missions. You'll sometimes see it BAM, business as missions. So if we can't go to a country with a missionary visa, they'll never let us in. Maybe we can go as a teacher, teaching English. Maybe I can go as a businessman, or maybe I can go because I have a degree in agriculture and I can help with their crops. And by getting in that way, I can then share the gospel. That has become much more prominent as a result of these countries being closed off. And I just have a picture there of Kenneth Cragg. He's an Anglican bishop who really led the way in the 20th century of becoming a scholar on Islam. He said if we're really going to reach them, we need to know what they think, what they believe, so that we can respond to them. 20th century mission in Africa, despite the difficulties, there's such a move of God in Africa. I mean, 20th century, you've got all the colonies are now becoming independent. You've got tribalism, you've got coups, military governments, dictatorship, HIV/AIDS, poverty, droughts, famine, all of that. And yet the church has grown from 10 million to 400 million. I've been traveling to Uganda many times over the last several years, and one time one of the guys there asked me, he said, why do Americans come over to Africa so much? I was like, that's an easy question, because God is at work here in a way that he is not in America. There is such openness to the gospel in Africa. There's such hunger from the church to want to grow and be trained that we just don't see that here as much. And so, I think it was Henry Blackaby who said, find where God's at work and join him there. If God's at work in Africa, that's where I want to go. And we certainly see that in the 20th century. Latin America, a lot of change there. Most of your Roman Catholics in the world live in Latin America. And at the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of evangelicals kind of just wrote it off. And they said, basically, it's been reached already. It's an evangelized region. But then there were a few people who come along and said, okay, not necessarily. There's actually still mission work to do there. A lot of your Roman Catholics in the region, a lot of that's just nominal cultural stuff. There's a lot of other religious elements that get involved. And then we just need to take the gospel still. And so in the 20th century, there have been massive movements of evangelicals in Latin America. A lot of that is due to the spread of Pentecostal Christianity. If you know about the Azusa Street revivals in the early 1900s, Protestant Pentecostal Christianity is just exploding in South America and in Africa as well. There are some okay versions of it, but there's also a lot of problems with that. In reaching Latin America, it's not been an easy task. Some of you are familiar with people who have died doing that. Probably Jim Elliot's one of the most famous. He's not the only one, but his wife Elizabeth Elliot has made that story very prominent. And so it's not been easy to reach some of these lost, I say lost in the sense of they're out there, but just these difficult to reach people groups in Latin America. Some places the church is exploding, places like Brazil and some countries, more than that. But there's a lot of work there to be done still today. And so finishing up this section, and then I have a couple of comments. Who were the 20th century missionaries? Notice the difference here. A lot of them are now entrepreneurs and visionaries. We're sort of seeing this change in the 20th century with a different type of people that are going. We're seeing a lot more women, and we're seeing a lot of what we call global South believers. That's basically everybody but North America and Europe. The church where it's growing most quickly is in the global South, everywhere but here. And what's going to be interesting in the 21st century is we're going to see the center of Christianity, if you will, go from the West to the South. And this is really monumental. If you think about in the last couple centuries, missionaries, everything came from the West. We were going to reach the nations. But what's happened now is North America, certainly the U.S. and Europe, we're all in sort of religious decline. We're increasingly post-Christian. And so the center of vibrant, growing, spreading Christianity is now in all those countries that we sent missionaries to. And what's amazing is that a lot of those countries, like in places like Africa and Asia and even Latin America, have begun sending missionaries back to us. Okay? So who are they? And then what did they do? All kinds of stuff. Translation, church planning, evangelism, all the things. So I want to end here quickly with just a couple of takeaways. I know we covered a lot, and that's the point, because I want you to see that there's a lot. But I also hope that maybe a couple of things that we talked about might stand out, maybe a story, maybe a person. So as we try to sort of summarize 2,000 years, what are some takeaways? I think number one, the importance of cross-cultural mission work. If you're going to reach non-believers, you got to step across that line. Maybe that means going to another country. Maybe that just means going next door because your neighbor's from another country. One of the things about globalism now is that the nations are coming to us. And if you're going to share Christ with somebody, whether they are from your country or not, whether they speak your language or not, maybe they grew up with you. It's your best friend from childhood. You speak the same language, culture. Because they are not a Christian, they live in an entirely different world. And to reach them for Christ, you are stepping into a different world. And we see that with all of our missionaries here. Frequent commitment to learning language and culture for the sake of mission. Do the hard work, right? If you've got a friend who's a Muslim, read about it. If you've got a friend who's a Buddhist, you've got a friend who's a Mormon, read about it. Study. Put the work in to try to reach them. We see the importance of mercy ministries alongside mission. One of, I think, the greatest failures or wrong decisions in the 20th century was that a lot of the Protestant missions gave up this part of their work. They sold the hospitals, they sold the schools, and they said, we're just going to be about preaching and church planting. I think that was a misstep. There's a place for this. It doesn't replace preaching. That's certainly a problem. But there's still a need for mercy ministries. Fourthly here, the untold thousands who labored and their names are only known in heaven. As a millennial, as a youngster, one of my greatest fears, I think, as a youngster is, and I'm getting older, but as a youngster, is that I'll have a life that didn't make some sort of a contribution. I didn't do something amazing. That's what my generation worries about. But I've been very encouraged in this study as I thought about those who labored and served and did wonderful things, and nobody knows about them because their names are known in heaven. And sometimes we may think that if I'm going to be involved in mission work, I've got to do something just like monumental. I've got to build some new mission agency. I've got to travel to some island and see a revival. That may be you. But you can also make a huge investment. You can make a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? You can have a huge impact, even if no one knows your name. Maybe your mission service is prayer. Maybe it's organizing a mission giving. Maybe it's paying for someone else to go because you can't. You don't have to be the next Adoniram Judson or Lottie Moon. You can just be you, and you can make a huge impact. And then lastly, of course, the continued need for mission. I know you guys are going to have a class on that maybe next week or so. And so I just want to wrap up here with 2 short book recommendations. If you are a history nerd and you're looking for some heavy reading, Stephen Neal's A History of Christian Missions. It is dense, but it's got a lot in it. If you're like me and you want something more approachable, much more easy to read, then I recommend Dr. Smither's book, Christian Mission. This is the one that I used a lot for tonight. It is very short. I mean, it's concise is in the name there. It's very short. It's easy to read. It's interesting. I just encourage you to read it. A couple pages a day. Learn more about what the church has done throughout the centuries. And who knows what God might do for you and might call you to do. So, thank you very much. Appreciate you.